blurred, out of focus images. We all get them, no matter how experienced you are as a photographer. But what if there was a button you could press which will improve how you focus your camera? Well, there is, and it's one that pro photographers use all the time. Before I tell you what the button is and tell you how to set it up, let me tell you why you want to make this change. By default, cameras have focusing on the shutter release button. You half press the button, the camera focuses, you complete the press and take the shot. Now this makes sense because most of the time you actually want the camera to focus before you take the shot. But what if you don't want to enable all the focus points and you don't want the camera to decide what it thinks the subject should be? Well, you could enable just one focus point, but that may mean that your subject isn't where you want it in the frame. Or you could move the focus point to where you want it to be, which actually isn't a bad thing, but it does take time. So enter focus recompose. Whoa, that was a bit literal. Okay. This is what many photographers do. You point the camera with the active focus point over the subject, half press the shutter release, recompose the image, take the shot. And it's a great technique, but it's not perfect. Sometimes there may be a long gap between recomposing and getting the perfect expression. During that time, you've got to keep your finger half pressed, and there's a risk you might accidentally take the shot early. And then you've got to start over, focus, recompose. And not everyone finds it easy to keep the right pressure on the shutter. If you've got any tremble in your hands, you'll know how difficult that is. And what about photographing in the winter when you're, well, wearing gloves? With gloves on, it's really hard to get just the right amount of pressure for a half press of the shutter release. And that's when you're wearing more appropriate gloves than, well, these. So what's the answer? The answer is to separate focusing from the shutter release. To do this, we're going to use a button on the back of the camera that's labeled typically AF on. And by pressing this button, it will cause the camera to focus, and this technique is called back button focusing. But wait, there's more to it than just pressing a button. You have to make some other changes to the camera, particularly to various settings on there, to make it work for you. Now, before I tell you what those changes are, I want to tell you first of all how I started using back button focusing and explain how it's not only improved my focusing, but it's helped me get the exposure right in my photography. I was on holiday in Croatia and I'd gone on a trip to Ston and Korčula. Hang on a minute, I never dress like that when I'm on holiday. I wish they'd get a decent actor for these reconstructions. He looks nothing like me. Anyhow, I'd just got my 5D Mark III and I hadn't read the manual. I'd been making photos of the city of Ston and the walls, and I began to notice that my exposures were slightly off. I did some tests and I had a light bulb moment. I realized what was going wrong. I was using focus recompose, and I hadn't realized that my new camera behaved differently to my old one. I really should have read the manual. I was shooting in aperture priority mode, and my old camera calculated the exposure when I fully pressed the shutter release. The 5D Mark III calculated it on the half press, which was when I was using to lock my focus. The problem was, if I did a big recompose, the exposure was calculated when the camera was pointing in the wrong direction. My moving over to back button focusing meant I could focus and then, and only then, press the shutter release after I've recomposed, meaning that my camera was pointing in the right direction when it was calculating the exposure for me. This gave me a big improvement on the images I was creating. And I could focus while wearing gloves too. Okay, so perhaps not these gloves. But that's not the only advantage of back button focusing. Let's look at 3 more. 1. When photographing things such as cars and trains or even runners, you can pre-focus the camera on a point by pressing the back button and then just wait for your subject to reach that point. 2. If you have your camera set to continuous focusing, or AI-Servo in Canon speak, then you have the advantage of one shot. You just press the button and release it, or hold the button and it will track focus. 3. In low light, you can choose to focus once, with the knowledge that if your subject doesn't move and you don't move, then the camera will stay in focus. This is great for night or dusk shooting, when the lens might otherwise start hunting for focus. So now you know why you want to do back button focusing. Let me show you how you can set it up on your camera. The AF on button might already be set to back button focus, but if it isn't, or you want to check how to do whether it is, this is the way. Go into the menus. Now on the Canon, it's on the orange setup menu, and you're looking for an option which says customize buttons or customize buttons and dials depending on the camera. I'm going to select customize buttons, and then I can just use the wheel to step through the different buttons to customize them. And I'm looking for the AF on button, and here it is. We've got the right button, and mine is currently set to metering and AF start. If I hit the set button, I could change that to different types of functions, but what we need for back button focusing is set to metering and AF start. So it's the AF start is the key part of that. So if I'm happy with that, hit OK. Now that's not the only function you'll have to change. We also want to remove the autofocus from the shutter release. So again, I just move through here until I find the shutter release. So here it is, shutter button half press, and you can see the different options here. By default, it's usually set to metering and AF start, which is what we don't want. You could set it to just metering start. What I tend to do is set it to lock. So either of those will work on there. The metering start will mean that so long as it's half pressed, it will work out the exposure in aperture priority and shutter priority mode, whereas the star function, the lock button, will actually, when you half press it, it will fix it at that particular value, which tends to be how I work, but for most people, I suspect metering start might be the better one. If you don't have an AF on button on your camera, you may have an alternative button that you can choose to program. Just make sure that it isn't a button you need for something else. And unfortunately, not all cameras will allow you to reprogram the buttons like that. You may also want to put the camera in continuous shooting or AI-Servo mode. On my camera, I would do it this way. I would go to quick menu, and I can choose my option here, and it's currently set to one shot, so I can then just use the dial, select servo and set. That's in continuous mode, which means now if I'm holding the AF on button, it's continually focusing on what's before it. And remember, you just have to release the AF on button to lock the focus. Now your camera may well be different to mine, but the process will be similar to get it all set up. Warning, warning, warning. At this point, I have to give you a big warning about back button focusing. You will miss loads of shots and get out of focused images at first. This is because your muscle memory is set to just press the shutter release. You'll forget to press the button at the back of the camera. So don't make the switch when you're about to do a key client shoot or you're about to shoot a wedding. The best time to make your switch is when you've got time to play with your photography. Perhaps when you're on holiday, or any other time where it doesn't really matter if you lose one or two of your shots. And once you've got to grips with back button focusing, you can turn your attention to other aspects of your photography, such as creating a sense of place in your images. and this video will show you exactly how to do it. Until next time, thanks for watching and keep making great photos. Bye for now.